It wasn't love at first sight. For me, it never is. But I think it might have been love at second sight. I had watched one of his YouTube videos once before, when it had randomly popped into my suggested box, and while I had found it mildly amusing on the first go-around, he hadn't struck me in quite the same way that he did the second time. The second time I watched it, we were in the thick of the 2016 election, and everything seemed to be crashing down around us. It had already been a heartbreaking year for me, having started out the year by losing two of my biggest artistic inspirations in the form of David Bowie and Alan Rickman within days of each other. As ridiculous as it may seem to get oneself so worked up over the deaths of a couple of celebrities, these guys were more than that for me. They were my muses, my surrogate artistic fathers who had shaped the way I saw my own creative output. Their death sent me spiraling into a deep existential crisis, which, being in my 30s, had already been threatening on the horizon of my mental health for quite some time. I poured my grief into the writing of a deeply philosophical novel about technology forcing art into mass-produced, computer-generated, cookie-cutter pieces that no longer showed the presence of humanity's drive to create things. I promised myself I would no longer ingest junk food art, as I called it, and stopped watching a slew of mindless reality shows and YouTube channels because I wanted my mind to be crisp and clear and ready at all times for inspiration, rather than distracted and disconnected. My strict diet of only thought-provoking content, combined with the dour and anger-inducing election coverage, began to take its toll on me, and I soon lapsed into old habits of finding something to just have on, something to tune out to, something that required no thought and had no reminders of death or the terrible things humanity inflicted upon one another. For whatever reason, most likely a subconscious yearning from my childhood, that thing ended up being My Little Pony. No, I don't consider myself a Brony, or a Pegasister, or whatever they call themselves. But I had been keeping track of the newer version of the show, and in doing so, I had stumbled across some of the online Brony content. I found them to be a fascinating group of creatives with a generally sweet demeanor, and I enjoyed observing them from a sociological standpoint because of their openness to ignoring gender norms. I'd first heard the term Brony at a barbecue years ago, which was being held at a friend's house. I don't remember how the subject had been raised, but I remember listening with amazement as someone described to me the newest version of the cartoon show about rainbow-colored horses that I'd once tortured my mother with as a child. They put all these pop culture references in it, the guy said, like Doctor Who and Star Wars and all kinds of stuff. And it's attracted all these grown men in their 20s and 30s who are devoted fans of the show, and they're called Bronies. I'd laughed, amazed, and fascinated. At some point, I figured out I could watch the show on Netflix, and that then caused the app to recommend I watch documentaries about Bronies. And from there, I discovered their online presences through various YouTube sketches and blogs. I realized very quickly that they were, for the most part, just a sweet, good-natured bunch of socially awkward nerds who just wanted to watch their cartoons without judgment. And while I could see glimpses of the unseemly underside of the fandom, the focus of the vast majority of them was in retaining their innocence and optimism. I observed them casually from afar for several years, like Jane Goodall and her apes, watching as their infrastructures changed and new stars rose and fell out of favor. It was a silly little hobby, but it was the reason that his video popped up in my feed. Yes, he is a Brony. I barely remember the first time I watched one of his videos. It was about some scandal or other in the Brony universe. I barely recognized the names of those involved, and I didn't understand some of the more insider terms he was throwing out. But like anything on YouTube these days, there was drama involved, and so was presented with a gravitas it probably didn't deserve. The guy hosting the 40-minute video like most bronies I'd come across, was more articulate and witty than one would expect from a grown man who watches cartoons. But not having enough knowledge of the inner workings of the Bronyverse, I didn't think much of his well-crafted diatribe. That is, until it popped up in my feed again one gloomy fall day. It was late October, and all of Chicago was riding high on the possibility of a Cubs World Series win. The first one in more than a century. As a born and bred baseball fan, watching the Cubbies fight tooth and nail to the end was one of the most exciting things I'd ever witnessed. And it turned out to be the shining bright spot in a year filled with tragedy, depression, and anger, not just for me, but worldwide. We got to bask in the warm glow of the Cubs' victory for a whole week before Donald Trump became our president. And the realization that I no longer understood the world around me to the extent I thought I did once again sent me down into a deep, deep hole of depression and anxiety. It was while in a state of utter despair that I turned once again to the junk food art, or more precisely, to the innocuous and colorful world of the bronies. It was then that his video popped up once again in my feed. But this time, as I watched, something different happened. I saw the man in the video in a different way. Yes, he was still witty and articulate, but now I noticed the subtle nuances of his text, the sly references to classic British comedies, the kitschy 60s musical interludes and transitions, the skill of his editing and sound design, the gorgeous cadence of his well-trained voice, and the natural charm he exuded through the camera lens. He was good-looking enough, I suppose. I've never really been a good judge of physical beauty in men or women. But there was something more about him that really pulled me in. I spent several days going through every single video on his channel. Some were odd, short little jokes. Some were amusing little animations. But mostly, they were videos about ponies. Deeply analytical explorations of plot holes, logical fallacies, and the character verisimilitude within the show. I watched them all several times over, each time gathering more and more useless information about such varied topics as fan fiction, show writers, cutie mark mythology, and other things I never thought I needed to know. But I was listening to those videos not out of any obsession with the ponies, but out of a growing fondness for him. He was an animator, a composer, and a seemingly well-rounded, cultured guy with a flair for the dramatic and the campy that appealed to my own sensibilities. The Monty Python references were one thing, but the obscure Blackadder quotes told me that he would pass my secret friendship test with flying colors. This was a test I often administered in college, where I would let loose some Eddie Izzard line or quote a sketch from Fry and Laurie and see if anyone picked up the following dialogue. If and when it worked, that person was immediately worthy of my friendship. I'd play his videos while I was getting ready for work in the morning or when I was trying to fall asleep at night. His voice was such a growing comfort that I began to search out more of his work and found hours of streams and interviews he'd done with other bronies across the years. He's kind of famous in their world. And as I kept filling my ears with that comforting clipped tenor of his, the lanky man with the rubber face on the screen began to grow more and more beautiful in my eyes. He was around my age, from what I could gather, and after realizing I'd been wrong in my initial assumption that he was British, I sussed out that he was, in fact, Australian. I was fairly sure I'd even figured out the region he habitated in. I learned his favorite movie. I learned what music he liked. I puzzled over everything from his religion to his marital status to his sexual orientation. From what I could tell, he was devoutly Catholic, not married, and mostly straight, with a possible affinity for transvestitism. Everything about him was suddenly fascinating. And that is where I started to lose my mind. I read an article recently about demisexuals, and after a lifetime of telling myself that I simply didn't fit neatly into any established sexual orientation, I suddenly found myself identifying heavily with the characteristics being described. Demisexuals, it seems, find it difficult to become attracted to others. They differ from asexuals in that, rather than feeling no sexual attraction, they actually feel deep sexual attraction, but only to those they've become emotionally attached to. That rings extremely true for me. I've never been one for casual encounters, and attempts at online dating have always left me feeling like I'm forcing myself into situations I'm not entirely comfortable with. The few true infatuations I've felt in my life have always been extremely deeply felt and have always come out of the blue. There was the guy in college I didn't know very well, but suddenly found myself counting my encounters with him like jewels in a treasure box. There was the friend I reconnected with after many years, and found myself longing for his attention in quite an unhealthy way. There was the coworker who showed a touch of affection towards me, and after I'd reciprocated, I found myself in the middle of a sordid drama I never intended on engaging in. But I hadn't encountered those feelings in many years. I dated a little, experimented with my own comfort levels in getting close to people, but I feared I'd never be truly attracted to anyone. As I watched his videos, I felt the obsessive demon that lurked within me starting to raise her head and peer through the darkness. She'd spotted something shiny, and she was going to make it hers. I learned that he had a Patreon account, and I decided to sponsor him as part of a flurry of liberal guilt donations we all made after Trump became president and threatened to take down every institution we cared about. I told myself that I was doing it to support a good artist who had brought me solace in my time of need. Aside from the ponies, the guy had genuine talent, and I hoped to see more of what he could do. Upon confirming my donation, I was given a message that contained his Skype name, and after a lot of nail-chewing and deliberation, I decided to send him a message. I summarized my situation for him. Not a brony, but liked the show, found his videos a much-needed comfort, wanted to see what else he could do with his talents, etc. I then patiently waited for a reply. And by patiently, I mean I downloaded the Skype app onto every device I owned and obsessively checked it for days. He finally did respond on a Sunday morning, and I literally sprang out of bed to respond to him. He was polite enough, maybe a little guarded, with good reason, and we chatted briefly about what he was working on, what I was working on, and other things, until he cut the conversation short by saying he needed to head to bed. It was nearly 2 a.m. in Australia, as I well knew, having now become extremely familiar with the time difference between our hemispheres. This silly little conversation had me giggling to myself like a schoolgirl at the mere thought of him. It was bad, really bad. I could think of nothing else except for how to next engage him further. I decided to ask him if he might be willing to do some commission work for me, a service I legitimately needed for my food blog. I wrote out another well-crafted, long-winded, witty, and urbane message to him and waited. And waited. And waited. For a week. As the days passed with no response, my anxiety started to rage. He thinks you're insane. He's insulted by your offer of work. He doesn't need your charity. You don't exist to him. He just thinks you're another rabid little fangirl. Every scenario possible of why he wasn't responding to my message ran through my head, and with each passing day, they ran quicker and quicker. I literally began losing sleep, waking up in the middle of the night to check my iPad to see if he had messaged me. Finally, I realized I had to stop for the sake of my own sanity. I wrote a third message, another long-winded, overly wordy, self-pitying thing that I was certain would show off my presence of mind and intelligence so that he wouldn't think I was too crazy. I apologized profusely if I had offended him in some way. I again explained that I had not been entirely mentally sound as of late. I wished him luck on all his endeavors. I then sent the message and immediately deleted him from my contacts to stop myself from bothering him any further. And that seemed to work for a while. But he had a Twitter. At first, I was content to quietly stalk him there. He rarely posted, and when he did, it was mostly pony-related, but it made me feel like I still had some tenuous connection to him. I figured if I was wrong to assume the worst, he might want to reach out on Twitter and explain why he hadn't responded to me before. So I followed him and proceeded to obsessively check Twitter several times a day. By mid-December, I was craving interaction with him so badly that I took a chance and actually tweeted him a link to some joke article about a guy making a Warhammer game with all My Little Pony figurines. The mere act of allowing myself to reach out to him made me feel so much better, as though I had released some internal pressurized valve. And then, he actually replied. Well, sort of. He retweeted the article. But it was acknowledgement. Blessed acknowledgement. He didn't think I was insane. He was willing to interact. I was over the moon with that silly, single retweet. I tried again at Christmas, tweeting him a Blackadder gif. He liked the tweet. Merry Christmas to all the world. He liked the tweet. I tried again around New Year's, sending him a link to a BBC special by a comedian I remembered he enjoyed. He replied properly this time. I was certain now I was in the clear. He didn't think I was a dangerous assailant out to find his address so that I could send him locks of my hair made into dolls and dressed in clothing made out of screenshots from his videos. He was willing to interact with me on a normal human level. I started sending him links somewhat regularly that I thought might inspire his work. Little animated films I'd come across, music I thought he might like, articles I thought he'd find interesting. Nothing too overly aggressive, just a tweet every few days or so. If he replied to it or retweeted it, the adrenaline rush would sustain me. If he ignored it, I'd panic and delete the tweet, lest his delicate sensibilities should become disgusted after catching sight of it again. Once, I even tweeted him a link to one of my stories on this very channel, but it was never acknowledged, so I deleted it within a day. Back and forth we went for months. I thought you might like this short film I found. Cheers! What do you think of this sweet little animation? Thanks! Love the narration! We bonded over a shared admiration for John Cleese and Amanda Palmer. He even wished me a happy birthday. I had finally achieved some semblance of a casual online friendship, and I was happy with that. But there was still that eternal yearning for his attention, for his conversation, for his company, and it nagged at me every so often. I couldn't help noticing that his Twitter presence had increased in the time I'd been interacting with him. He'd only had a few hundred tweets in total by late 2016, but he was near to 1,000 by March. His Brony friends noticed it too, teasing him for his sudden influx in interactions. He remained coy, never mentioning that any change had taken place. Then, one day, I sent him an artsy short film about a bunch of anthropomorphic cats in a film noir world, and rather than his usual reposting of it, he replied back with a long series of tweets about his thoughts on the piece. I was shocked and thrilled. I engaged with him in live conversation for the first time since our initial November Skype chat, counterpointing his points with as much wit as I could muster on the spur of the moment, and he kept replying back. We were back and forth for an hour or so, debating the merits of the writing and the style. I teased him a little at one point, asking if he just didn't care for sleazy jazz clubs. He replied he'd never been to one. I told him they weren't everything they were cracked up to be. He replied, "We should go sometime." Even though I knew he wasn't being serious, that he lived literally on the other side of the globe and had no intention of ever coming anywhere near my hemisphere, I accepted his invitation without question. After that, I felt safe enough to send him a contact request on Skype. I hoped he knew that I had no intention of bugging him or freaking out on him, but I wanted to give him an open door should he ever want to converse with me in private. He accepted the request, but he never messaged me. I began to wonder if I had, in fact, fallen in love with him. It was such a juvenile notion, first of all, and secondly, I wasn't even entirely sure I knew what being in love really felt like. But I could not get him out of my head. Every time I saw Australia mentioned, it was like a sign from the universe telling me I had to reach out to him. The sight of a My Little Pony toy in Walgreens made me blush uncontrollably. In my more generous moments with my own imagination, I let myself picture what it might be like if he did come to visit me, stayed with me, let me take him out on the town. But I knew enough to realize that I really did not know him. I knew a picture of him, a snapshot, a curated idea, but I did not know the real man. He'd mentioned having mental disorders himself once or twice, one of which I knew to be a case of OCD. How severe it was, I had no idea, and I suspected he also suffered from depression and anxiety based on statements he'd made here or there. My own depression and anxiety have never been officially diagnosed, but I suspect any trained psychiatrist would spot them in my behavior immediately. It is perhaps the fact that I have lived with these mild disorders most of my life that alerts me to them in others. Either that, or I'm what the New Age types call an empath. Whatever the case, I noticed a certain ennui in his tweets last week, and trying to help without being too intrusive, I sent him a song, replied to a few of his sentiments, and generally tried to smile brightly for him in the hopes of a digital pat on the head. And I got that pat on the head, but then he sort of slipped back into the darkness. It's been a week now since he last filled up my morning with a flurry of tweets. I sent him a little animation last week, hoping to coax him into another long Twitter discussion, but so far, he's yet to acknowledge it. I'm being daring and leaving it up this time, because I think it's fairly pertinent, as it involves a cute and cuddly animal that was ostracized by society and decided to immerse himself in his television rather than try to make friends. That is, until another cute and cuddly outcast tries to reach out to him. The film ends with a ringing phone, an open invitation to communication. Unable to bear his lack of engagement, I actually sent him a short Skype message over the weekend, apologizing for unloading on him previously. It was only 3 sentences this time, no long-winded, pretentious, witty, well-sculpted letter. He hasn't replied to that either. In fact, aside from a few little tweets to his other online friends, he hasn't been around much at all this past week. I still don't know if I really am in love with him, but I do know that I worry about him.